Demonized and suppressed by the war on drugs, psychedelic medicines are making their return, and we're here to bring you the latest in scientific research and therapeutic practices involving psychedelic medicines from psilocybin to ayahuasca to DMT and beyond. This is the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast. I'm Dr. Lynn Marie Morsky, your guide in this journey, and today we're going to be discussing microdosing and the placebo effect with Balazs Szigeti. Balazs studied physics at Imperial College and then earned a PhD in computational neuroscience from the University of Edinburgh. After graduating, he worked as a biomedical software engineer at the Institute of Genetics in New York, and then switched his career to study psychedelics. Using his self-blinding methodology, Balazs conducted the largest placebo-controlled study on psychedelics to date, studying the effects of microdosing. Balazs currently investigates the intersection of placebo effects and psychedelic medicine using novel statistical and experimental techniques. Now, I've been waiting forever to have Balazs on to talk about his study on microdosing and the results that the media a bit negatively described as microdosing is no more than a placebo effect. And that's only a very small part of the picture. And I've had Balazs explain start to finish how the study worked and what the findings mean for those who are considering microdosing or who are currently microdosing. And then we also go on to version 2.0 of the study that is coming up that you can participate in yourself. So hang tight for that. Now, before we get to Balazs, just a reminder that the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing here is to be construed as medical or legal advice. And one last reminder, if you are a clinician or anybody who sees patients, maybe a therapist, and you'd like to learn more about psychedelic medicine, please join the Psychedelic Medicine Association. It is our mission to educate everybody on the front lines of patient care about these medicines, and you can find us at psychedelicmedicineassociation.org. Now, without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today, Balazs.
Thank you for having me.
I've been very much looking forward to having this conversation because we have had other microdosing discussions, but as many are probably well aware, your study changed what a lot of people thought about microdosing, or maybe not even changed completely, but added a new layer to what we understand about microdosing. And that's when you put out the paper called Self-Blinding Citizen Science to Explore Psychedelic Microdosing. Can we start by having you explain a little bit about how you set up the trial that was associated with that report?
Yeah, sure. So I think the important part is to first to clarify this self-blinding bit from the title, because that's what really makes this study unique. And that's what I think makes it interesting, not just for microdosing and psychedelic research, but more widely applicable. So what this self-blinding thing is that with my colleague David Eritzu at Imperial College, we developed a way how citizen scientists can implement their own placebo control at home without clinical supervision. And this is a little bit of a conceptual breakthrough because previously, whenever anybody mentioned, not just with respect to psychedelics, but in any areas of research, placebo control, everybody was always thinking about clinical research because that's where placebo control exists. That's just like didn't exist outside of clinical research. And obviously, in clinical research, that's where you have opportunity to control for many, many possible effects, but it's also very expensive. It's a very heavy process to run a clinical trial. And what we did with this self-blinding is that we introduced a new way of doing placebo control and in a completely different context, which is more akin to observational studies where people are just doing their own thing, going on about their everyday life. But we have managed to develop this way that how you can add placebo control to your favorite intervention at home with this self-blinding process. To the best of my knowledge, this is the only self-blinding trial, not just in psychedelic research, but in the entire medical literature. And we are working hard on actually having some new self-blinding studies outside of the psychedelic realm. So more of such studies should come soon. But that's really the novelty aspect of it. I often say that like don't pay attention to psychedelics and microdosing. That's not the important part here. The important part is the self-blinding because this is a completely new way of doing science which is, well, if you're a science geek like myself, it's maybe even more interesting than psychedelics or microdosing.
And can you tell a little bit about how exactly the people who participated in this trial were selected? Because I believe they selected themselves, and how that self-blinding actually took place.
Sure. So yes, it was a trial that was entirely run on the internet. So there was not like, handpicking participants. Like if you agreed to do it and you were willing to follow the study protocol, then you were able to do it, which is another great aspect of citizen science, is that there is much less of a inclusion exclusion criteria. So you get results that are more reflective of real world efficacy rather than in a clinical trial where typically, researchers have a lot of space to play with the inclusion exclusion criteria, which can tilt the results one way or another easily. So we recruited primarily through the internet, like Twitter posts, podcast appearances, whatnot. But also, in particular in the US, like I teamed up with psychedelic societies and basically said that, hi, my name is Balazs and I'm doing this research. Can I come and give a talk to your society? And that worked really well with various psychedelic societies. And I told them about the placebo research that was done before, and microdosing, the relationship between the two. I try to convince people why is it a good idea to add placebo control to their microdosing routine, and that by and large worked. Now, in terms of the self-blinding itself, I'm going to tell you briefly how it is going to be done moving forward, because actually the process was much clunkier in the manuscript that is published. We streamlined the process, and happy to say here as well that there is going to be a self-blinding microdose study 2.0 launching later this year. So we got ethics approval, we got pretty much everything in place. We are just like putting on the last touches in the background on the IT infrastructure. So the way it's working is that participants are sourcing their own microdose. So that is like one of the cons, the downsides of self-blinding is that people are sourcing their own. Psychedelics are illegal in most parts of the world, so it's coming from the black market, leading to uncertainties with respect to purity. But once you have that microdose, what we are asking you is to basically hide your microdoses inside non-transparent gel capsules. And it's critical that the capsules are non-transparent because we don't want you to see whether there is a small piece of blotter paper inside or if it's completely empty, i.e. a placebo capsule. And this is one of the main tricks. And then the other part is that we are then asking you to basically take all of your microdose capsules, put it inside, like individually, one capsule at a time into a zip bag, and then also slip a QR code next to the zip bag. And again, QR codes are just these two-dimensional barcodes that you can read with your smartphone. So at this point, you're still aware which of the capsules are microdose and placebo, and one by one, you put in a QR code and you put in a capsule, seal the bags, put them aside. And then you do the same process with your placebo capsules, but we give you a separate set of QR codes for that. And then once all of the capsules are in a zip bag, you just mix them together in a big bowl, and then you just randomly select one, and then you scan this code, the QR code, with your smartphone, and you have to enter that number into a web interface that we are providing with the experiment, and it basically tells you what to do with that capsule. It's either telling you to discard that capsule, or it tells you something along the lines that take it on the Wednesday of the second week of your dosing schedule. And you pull capsules like this until you basically fill up your dose schedule for a 4 weeks long dosing period. So, like, for me to do this self-lining takes about 15 minutes, but of course, like, I did it much more often than maybe it is healthy. I think, for somebody who's coming new to the process, it should take about 30 to 45 minutes. So it takes a little bit of time, but it's not that much. And we also have like a nice video where I'm showing you how to do it step by step. So it's not as daunting as it initially sounds.
That does sound a little bit daunting. Mostly because I'm assuming it involves a printer. And the second there's a
Yes,
printer
it
involved,
does. It does. Yes.
it's like Office Space all over again.
Yeah.
Okay, so for those who have not read the paper, you mentioned that they're throwing a blotter paper in these. Was this an LSD only study?
No, so mushroom, you were also able to use mushroom, but with mushroom, it's a little bit more complicated. And where the complication comes in is that you can feel the weight of the mushroom microdose. Like, the small piece of blotter paper, you can't really distinguish that from an empty capsule based on the weight. but a typical mushroom microdose, zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.3 grams, that is heavy enough that you just feel it from the capsule. So the funny story actually here is that we realized that, and initially we suggested people to use basically any sort of filler material that they would be comfortable swallowing and ingesting. So many people use flour or sugar, but then during the like we had sort of like a pre-run before we made the protocol official, and then many people complained that, but actually when you're burping, you can feel a little bit of a mushroomy aftertaste after the microdose. So that gave us some headache how to make the protocol burp proof. So currently it is advised that use a chaga mushroom, which is a non-psychoactive mushroom type. The point is that it also has that slightly earthy, mushroomy aftertaste if you are burping, and hence we can claim the protocol to be burp proof, which is just a funny side story. But these are the things that we had to worry about when making this protocol.
Yeah, absolutely. Is this the world's also the first burp-proof protocol? Not only the first self-blinding, but
I haven't looked into that, but probably yes.
I like that. I like that. That's fantastic. And how many people ended up participating in the study?
So about 250 signed up, and remarkably about 190 finished it. And that is a very, very high adherence rate. And I think part of the reason is because the effort was front loaded. So like the self-blinding, this process happening before you actually start the study. So I think, for many people, if they have, sort of like, put that hour into the setup, then they just went through the entire experience. And also I should say that and this is going to be the same in the upcoming self-blinding microdose trial, is that if you complete the experiment, we are sending participants a personalized report on their performance so they can see how they have improved on various aspects that we are measuring during the trial. So I think, this is just like resonates with the spirit of citizen science. You give us something, we give you back something. You allow us to collect the data, but in return, we are delivering this personalized report, which may help you to decide whether you want to continue with your microdosing regime or not.
I love that. Well, that's great advertisement. I'm sure we'll put a link at the end of the episode to where to find you for 2.0. But okay, now we've kept people in suspense long enough. Can you please tell us what the results of the trial showed?
So it was a little bit of a mixed bag. And let's start with what we call the accumulative results. And the accumulative measures were the change from baseline to after this 4 weeks long dosing regime, which is arguably more important than the acute measures, which are basically how you feel 2 to 6 hours after you take the capsule. So if you're looking at these accumulative measures, so again, the change before and after this 4 weeks long dosing period, then what we have found is that in a number of psychological outcomes, if you just look at the microdosing group alone, then there were statistically significant improvements. So, for example, the primary outcome of the study was a well-being scale, and there microdosings did improve statistically significantly in this change over time test. And I think that in a lot of way validates the positive anecdotes about microdosing. We show it with data that people who are microdosing for 4 weeks do better than when they started. Now, the interesting bit is when you add the placebo control group to the whole thing, because unsurprisingly, people also improved in the placebo control group. And the difference in the magnitude of the improvement between the placebo and the microdose group, that's not significant anymore. It is a little bit higher on most of the scales, but the difference is not statistically significant anymore. So what that basically suggests that yes, microdosers do improve on a number of psychological parameters, but you can reproduce that same improvement if you give people deceptive placebos. So I think it is very important to also emphasize that the change over time test is positive, because that's very often get lost in the conversation, not just around this study, but I think in clinical trials, that the way we are evaluating medicines is based on the difference from placebo treatment to your active treatment. But that's not really what the patients are experiencing when they are participating in a trial. What they're experiencing is the change over time. So that's why I'm saying that the results of this microdose trial were mixed, because like you can make an argument that this change over time is the more important outcome, and that was statistically significant. But the comparison of the magnitude of change in the placebo group versus the magnitude of change in the microdose group, that was not significant anymore. It was not significant on any of the scales, I should add. So anyway, that's why I say, it's a mixed bag. I wouldn't say that, like, I think, the media coverage of the study was a little bit more negative than how we are perceiving microdosing. But that's just the way it is.
Yeah, and I think that's why I rephrased what I had initially said at the beginning, because it's not that I mean, the media wants it to make it sound like it changed what we thought about microdosing, but in the end, microdosing had worked in your trial. It's just that it didn't work so much better than placebo. So, as you said, in real world practice, the people who microdose did end up doing better cumulatively at the end. So it's not as though nothing happened. But I think the alteration in our thought about microdosing is how much of that might be placebo effect versus actual medicine effect. And I have a question, because you have the two groups and you've got LSD and you've got psilocybin, and the people who had the psilocybin because of the burp effect were actually taking chaga mushroom, whereas the people who took the LSD were taking nothing. Did you notice any difference between those two groups?
No, so generally speaking, like we analyzed everything for like the entire sample combined, the LSD microdosers only and psilocybin microdosers only, and there was no noticeable difference between any of these groups. So like generally, I just always present the results as monotomous, like without differentiating between the substances, and that is because we just don't see any reason why there would be a difference. Or sorry, it's not we don't see a reason. Our data does not indicate that there would be any difference in the outcomes. Although I must add, and this is a little bit of a teaser for an upcoming paper, the one difference that we have noticed, and this is preliminary analysis, but it seems like that with LSD microdosing, there is some buildup of tolerance that we did not detect in psilocybin microdosing. Now, there is some pharmacological reason why that might be a true effect, but on the other hand, our LSD sample is much bigger than the psilocybin sample. Self-blinding is just easier to implement with LSD blotters because you don't have to fill the placebo capsules. So, like, maybe it is just that because we had like a larger sample, there was less statistical noise and we detected the tolerance in LSD microdosing. Maybe it's also there for psilocybin microdosing and we just didn't see because the vast majority of participants used LSD. But anyway, that's the only difference that we see in our trial results.
So was that you were seeing the acute changes, the acute effects were getting less as the trial went along?
So actually, it is a quite convoluted way how we infer tolerance. I think it would take a little bit too long to get into that because there are a few statistical tricks and it's unpublished manuscript. So I'll rather pass on this question.
Sure.
But it is yeah, like there is a yeah. Let's wait for
We'll
the
have
upcoming
we'll have
manuscript.
yes, we'll have a follow-up episode,
Sure.
Balash. We will cover that in a follow-up. Amazing. What I would like to cover now is that you've recently, or you are in the process of publishing a follow-up paper, not the 2.0, but a paper that delves even more deeply into this placebo effect. So if you could tell us a little bit about that publication.
Sure. So one of the central motivation for writing that paper is because there was something that I felt like intellectually dishonest about the first self-blinding study, the one which is already published. And the reason is that it was a placebo-controlled study in the sense that we had a placebo control group. But it wasn't really placebo controlled in the sense that participants guessed their drug allocation at a much higher rate than chance. So, if you we ask participants to always take a guess whether their capsule was a microdose or a placebo capsule at the end of all dosing dates. And if participants are really just guessing randomly, then you would expect them to get it right about 50% of the time. But that's not what we got empirically. What we got is that they guessed correctly in about 72% of the cases, which is much higher than the 50%. So there is definitely something to microdosing that allows them to distinguish it reliably from placebo. So it was a placebo-controlled study in the sense that there is a placebo-controlled group, but it wasn't placebo-controlled. That maybe it didn't really I wanted to say that it didn't fool anybody. That's not true. It did fool a few people, but certainly not everybody. Like, it was the blinding worked to some degree. And when we published the first study, I was like, okay, I'm sure that other people have thought about this before, and there are some methods, statistical or otherwise, how to take this into consideration. But it turned out that there is none about this. And this is in particular surprising because since I gathered a few other data sets, so more classic psychopharmacological treatments, such as SSRIs, and SSRI trials are also not blinded in that empirical sense. There is like a placebo control group, but from side effects, it's fairly easy to deduce when you are in the placebo versus the active intervention. So placebo control often doesn't work in other psychopharmacological interventions. And to me, and I'm a physicist by training, so I'm not an MD, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm a physicist. And like, to me, it was like really shocking that like people are not thinking about this. We have been running placebo controlled trials basically since the 50s, so let's say for 70 years now. And this is like really the central element of the placebo controlled trials, the double blind placebo controlled trials. Like, this is what we regard as the highest quality of evidence if you show efficacy against placebo control. But nobody ever checks whether the placebo control was really working as intended, which is just like, I don't know how it could have happened. Like, there is such a big emphasis on the methodological superiority of placebo controlled trials, and then nobody is checking whether it's really working or not. So anyway, I felt a little bit not dishonest, that's not the right word, but like intellectually incomplete how this study was published, because I didn't have the tools to address this question. That was just like none, and then at that point I just did not want it to wait until something comes up. But I took the challenge upon myself. This question that how can we adjust trial results for the quality of blinding, and we came up with the statistical method how you can take that into consideration. And again, I'm going to leave out a lot of the stats details here, but basically what we can do with these tools is that you give me your trial data, let's say the self-blinding microdose trial, where we know that the correct guess rate was 70%. And from this existing data set, what I can estimate is that what would be the outcome if the correct guess rate would be 50%, which corresponds to a perfectly blinded trial. So based on imperfectly blinded trial data, I can use this statistical pipeline to estimate what would be the outcome if it would be a perfectly blinded trial. And when we put our microdose data through this pipeline, what came out is that there was a lot of probably false negatives. And let me backtrack a little bit, because when you asked me about the trial results, I told you about the accumulative outcomes, which is this change over time over the 4 weeks long dose period. But we also measured some acute outcomes, which is how participants did a few hours after ingesting one of the capsules. And if you looked at that data naively, then there were some statistically significant differences between placebo and microdose on mood-related questions. The effect size was very, very small, so it wasn't particularly exciting. But what we see in this new analysis is that if we apply this statistical pipeline, then all of those results go away. So I think what is happening is that, and we call this the activated expectancy bias in this upcoming manuscript, that microdosing definitely does something that allows participants to distinguish it from placebo. There is an effect, and what are those effects? I'm going to get into that in a minute. But generally speaking, if you're in a placebo-controlled trial, and if side effects and or other factors give it away, whether you're in the placebo or in the active treatment intervention, then there is no difference between a placebo-controlled trial and an open-label drug administration trial. And sorry, I should clarify that the open-label drug administration, that's the scientific expression when the doctor tells you what you are going to consume. So the point being is that we call it the activated expectancy, because we blind you early on in the trial. We don't tell you what you are going to get, but then you can fairly often deduce from the side effects, whether you're in the placebo or in the active intervention group, and then your expectations about that intervention are activated. So what we show with this new analysis with respect to the microdosing results is that yes, there are some small microdose placebo differences naively in the data, but if you adjust the trial results for this for the imperfectness of the placebo control, then all of those effects are go away, which suggests that if the trial would be perfectly well blinded, then none of these acute differences would exist. But again, I would like to highlight that the differences are very small to begin with. They are statistically significant, but they are clinically not significant. So, it's not like that there's this very exciting and big acute effect. No, there's a very, very small effect, which we show that it's probably a false positive.
This is this has so many implications that I'm swimming through in my head. Like, if you're going to buy a microdose course, is it just as useful to have 2 or 3 of them in the month's worth have the active ingredient and the rest not? Like, these kinds of, like, what are the implications for these kinds of results, which are essentially between both studies, which are that yes, microdosing seems to help when people are taking a thing, especially if they think they're taking the thing, and how can we apply those, like you said, something being clinically relevant, like how can we clinically apply? I mean, as far as microdosing is clinical, yes, it's still basically illegal in most places that aren't decriminalized, but what, after all these results, especially with this second trial where you found, like, when you adjusted for the expectancy, then there was basically no change. How do you think one should interpret this, if is this a person who planned to microdose or is currently microdosing?
So I think what's important to emphasize is that when you are microdosing, or you know what, let's forget about microdosing because that's in a way not important. When you go to a doctor, then you're always being told what you're gonna get, which is one of these other strange things coming somewhat from a different external background, which is very strange about medicine, is that we evaluate medications based on the difference from placebo treatment, but then in primary care, which is how we experience healthcare, that just doesn't play a role at all because you're always being told what you are getting, right? So I think, this is where a little bit the implications are far reaching and go well beyond psychedelics because, like, essentially, what we are, or where things are going is that it's much more difficult to run placebo controlled trials than I think people are traditionally assuming because of the side effects. Because typically it is easy to deduce for participants whether they are getting an active or a placebo treatment. And there is some arguments in the literature that yes, you can use active placebos, but what active placebo to use is not obvious at all. We can go into that if you want to. But by and large, the point is that the placebo control, I think, it's a great idea. And it is really something which is should be followed, but it turns out that it is much more difficult to implement in practice than it should be. And if it cannot be implemented in practice, then what do we do instead of that without going back to the same mistakes as the pre placebo control era of medical research? And I think, with psychedelics, this issue is going to come to the forefront because, yes, with microdosing, there is some wiggle room in people recognizing their treatment. But when it comes to 200 micrograms of LSD versus placebo, there is zero uncertainty. Everybody will recognize when you're in the active placebo treatment. And I think the FDA and other regulators are starting to recognize this issue is that, okay, we have this promising new class of medications, psychedelics, but by definition, you cannot run blinded trials on that. And that means that by definition, you cannot really provide the highest quality evidence for the efficacy of these treatments. But the problem, I think, is much larger because it's not just about psychedelics. I feel very comfortable saying that with SSRIs, there is also a blinding issue. You can still blind better, of course, SSRIs than the psychedelic macrodoses. There are going to be some people who confuse, but by and large, statistically speaking, those trials don't have perfect blinding either. And then if you take even a sort of like one more step back, then you should realize that actually most medical interventions cannot be blinded by definition. And by that, I mean interventions such as mindfulness meditation, like, like the concept of placebo control doesn't even really work for that because then you would have to meditate without being aware that you are meditating. So, that's tricky to do. I don't know how to go about it. But the point being is that, like, the vast majority of interventions have that nature that you can't really blind for them. The placebo control as a concept really only works for psychopharmacological treatments. And even there in practice, it doesn't really work. So I think, what we are building the case for is that maybe we should change the way that we are evaluating medications. And I think what is the big question here is that, okay, but then how you go about it? What's the alternative framework? And I have some ideas how to go about it, but it's not like they need a bit more time to mature. But I think, this is, yes, we are building the case in a sense against the placebo controlled trials. And it's not that we want to replace them. It is just that if it doesn't work in practice, what is it that you do in practice that is, not quite has the same evidence standard, but which is more practically achievable. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit now, but these are some of my thoughts regarding this in my head.
I like how you have totally sidestepped the question that my listeners are waiting with bated breath to know, because they're like, should I microdose? Should I not microdose? You're like, no. Microdosing is not the issue. We're going to talk about whether or not the trials of the entire world are connected, right? But I'm gonna let you off the hook, and you don't have to answer that.
No, but I am happy to answer because obviously I get
Okay.
that question a lot. So, like, with the legal disclaimer, of course, that, like, this advice only applies if you're living in an area where it is legal, or at least decreed. If you're enthusiastic about microdosing, do it. And, don't read my papers, that's fine. But, then just go ahead and do it. Like, our results are very clear that probably you are going to experience improvements, in particular if you are enthusiastic about microdosing. If you believe in microdosing, if you think it should be good for you, just go ahead and do it. You, you know, you're not going to experience the difference relative to a placebo treatment. You're going to experience the change over time. And the other part, which I think it's important, is that you have to trigger your own placebo effects in a sense. Like, the placebo effect doesn't come for free. Like, it is like, it needs, in order to have a strong placebo response, there needs to be something that resonates with who you are, with your own being. And if microdosing resonates with you, then yeah, use it as your own active placebo, and probably you're going to get benefits from it.
I love it. Thank you for that take on your own results. I appreciate it. And
Actually, I have a funny anecdote here that, if you
give it
don't
to me.
mind, like, I think the listeners will appreciate. So it happened a few years ago. I was living in New York, and I was flying overseas. I was coming back to New York, and I there was something with my ear. I had an ear infection, and then obviously a long flight didn't help. The point is that I landed, and I had incredible pain in my ear. So, like, it was already sort of like late-ish, but I went to the first pharmacy, trying to get something for it. And then all I saw on the shelves were these homeopathic medications for ear infection and ear pain. And I was like, oh man, homeopathy. I just started to, leave the pharmacy. But then I remember, I stepped in the door of the pharmacy and saying, but you know what? My ear actually really, really does hurt. And I'm not going to find a doctor at this time. So maybe it's time to overwrite my scientific priors and get into homeopathy. So I ran a little experiment. I just got on my phone, and for 20 minutes I read everything that's positive about homeopathy, and really tried to, convince myself that homeopathy is the way to go. It is an intervention that's working. Millions of people are using it. They cannot be wrong. And I purchased the homeopathic medication. And you know what? It sort of helped me to get through that night. Like, it was really, really painful. And, like, it was this eardrop, and I don't know, maybe it was just because it was cold and it felt nice. It was like this oily something. And I was still on my phone reading positive stuff about homeopathy, but it helped me get through that night. The following day, I went to, like, a doctor, and, I got, like, proper medication. But, like, even in my context, like, somebody is very conscious about these issues. Like, self-suggestibility worked, and managed to trigger my own placebo response to a degree.
Do you know, Balash, how many people are going to comment in the Instagram? How many homeopathy fans are going to be like, that wasn't placebo effect. It really just cured his ear.
I am fine with that. Like, after this microdose study got published, like, the the feedback from the scientific community, I think that was very positive. But like, we got a lot from the microdosing community. Like I got hate mails, and there was just a lot of negativity, which is kind of like, funny from our perspective, because let's be honest, if our results would be positive, I wouldn't be talking to you. I would be talking to the investors of my microdosing startup, right? So, like, nobody lost more than we did with the trial results being negative. So, like, I mean, like, reading like some of the forum stuff, like, it's stuff like comes off it is that, like, we are these guys who are out there to get microdosing, but no, like, it would have been really, really nice, if the results would be negative. Unfortunately, they were not. So, like, we reported it honestly and truthfully. But, like, the victim, the victims are not microdosers. It's us, like, who put years of work into this and then basically fell flat at the end.
Well, I mean, that's of course one way to interpret it, and that's how the media interpreted it. But like you said, you actually did a positive thing for microdosers because you showed that microdosing, period, the act of taking a thing every day that you think is a microdose, did end up with a cumulative positive effect. So that can you imagine if your trial had ended up with no effect, right? Like that would have been actually super negative. Yours is just
But no, but that
didn't.
would be like incredibly strange, because the placebo effect is one of the most robust responses in medicine. So, like, we knew, or like, okay, we didn't knew for a fact, but like we had very good evidence base to think that there's going to be a placebo response in this trial. We always knew that. The question was whether that placebo, the microdose response is going to be superior to the placebo response. So, like, if and in particular, because we knew that it's going to be an enthusiastic crowd, people who do this study, we expected there to be a large placebo response. So, if that would have been like no placebo response, then I would be worried about that. We did a mistake somewhere along the lines.
Gotcha.
So, like, the fact that, people, if they are enthusiastically taking something and having a positive response, like, it sounds like esoteric, maybe in, like, sort of like new age spirituality circles, but it's really not. It's the placebo response, which is very, very well documented in a very wide range of medicine.
Well, I guess in theory, if the ones taking the actual microdose had shown no effect and the people taking the placebo did show effect, then it would have shown microdose makes you worse off than the placebo effects.
Yes,
That would have
yeah,
been an interesting finding.
yes, yeah, exactly, yeah. So our results are positive relative to that
Right.
scenario. Yes.
There, I'll make your worst case scenario. Your results are positive compared to that.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Um, I was going to ask, did you ask, this is the last question about this study because I definitely want you to talk about 2.0, but did you ask users whether or not they thought that this was going to help? Because like we're talking about them being enthusiastic, but did anybody enroll in the trial thinking this isn't going to help? And was that a question that you had asked for?
Yeah, so we didn't ask it exactly that way, but we asked them for like motivation and their expectations about how much improvement microdosing is going to have on their well-being and other psychological parameters. And by and large, it was a very biased sample, just as we expected it. I don't know the numbers from the top of my head. You can look it up in the published manuscript. It's all there, but it was clear from the response to those questionnaires that the vast majority of people came into this trial with positive expectations, which makes sense, because bear in mind, people had to source their own microdoses. So, like, at least they had to be willing, to probably, meet with a dodgy person in a dark alley to source their microdoses, which suggests is that, like, they're willing to take on some risk in order to microdose. But most people wouldn't do that unless there would be an expectation of a benefit, which is just another way of saying a placebo response. The expectation of a benefit. I think that's really the key phrase, that how you trigger your own placebo response. It's by the expectation of a benefit. And I think, given that in order to microdose generally, like, just sourcing your psychedelics and then just portioning it, that requires effort. I think most people wouldn't put in the effort to microdose without the expectation of a benefit. We tend to be busy people. People don't do just like, oh yeah, let me get some illegal drugs and spend an afternoon portioning it out without having some positive expectations about that activity.
That makes sense. Did you, I don't know if this was analyzed, but did you notice any difference in the response between the super enthusiastic versus those who had less confidence?
It's funny that you say that because I wanted to do that analysis, but I couldn't because practically everybody was super enthusiastic. So there was like no differentiation, like no meaningful differentiation in the sample. Everybody was just very, very enthusiastic. But here is like a small observation for you from the literature, which is a little bit about this. So there was one of the first controlled microdosing trials, and I'm sorry I'm going to butcher the first author's name, but Yanakieva, and they did a microdosing experiment with elderly people who were psychedelics naive, or I think the way it was defined is that they could have used psychedelics back in the past, but not in the past 5 years. And I think the population was people who are over 65 years old. So and in that study there was a condition where 20 micrograms of LSD was administered, and there was an item called good drug effects, which was a visual analog scale, which is basically a slider that you have to put between 0 and 100. 20 micrograms of LSD, good drug effects. And in this elderly sample where probably the view of psychedelics is not so positive, the average value on this good drug effect scale was 10. So far, so good. Few years later, Maastricht University publishes another microdosing trial where they also administer 20 micrograms of LSD, but in this case, the sample was college students, so young people, with a background in psychedelics, and luckily, this good drug effects item was also administered to them. So same drug in the same dose, but the mean response on the good drug effects item was 40. So the even though it was the same intervention, but in the young people who are like the hippies and the psychedelic enthusiasts, the good drug effects were 4 times as large compared to that elderly population where likely the psychedelics are not the new hot thing that they're gonna discuss at the next cocktail party.
That makes sense. And also it reminds me that you said these people are getting their microdoses from a dodgy person in a back alley, and just come to Silicon Valley. I'm not sure that I think they're just getting them over the water cooler at their
Yes,
high
yeah,
tech
yeah,
company.
yeah. Fair enough, fair enough, fair enough. Yes.
Very, but like that is definitely, the people who are in that 65 plus probably did have to get theirs in a dodgy back alley. So that,
Yeah.
I think you just explained the difference in mindsets and how that may affect how people
But this
experience
was
the
a
drug
clinical
itself.
study. So, they here the elderly people did not have to meet with the dodgy guy. They just
Good
had to
call.
meet with the researchers, and hopefully, not dodgy. They were not. It was anyway. So, this was both of these were like traditional clinical trials.
Gotcha. But I even think just like maybe that generation grew up where generally outside of this clinical trial, you were having to get your drugs in a dodgy back alley. And that, that you never know how stigma from all those days might have affected their
Yeah,
thoughts
sure,
on it.
and actually you are right. Like, I think that really changed. Maybe it's just my Eastern European background, but like, a few months ago I started Twitter, and I remember like I signed up one day, and like, like a week later I went back, and I already had 50 followers, and for a second I was very impressed with myself because I didn't do anything else other than to log in. But then I realized that all the 50 were drug dealers, like, and this is just like they just all started to follow me because I guess they saw that I'm in psychedelic research. So yes, times are changing quickly, that's for sure.
Yes, I would say some good portion of my day is blocking new Instagram followers who are trying to sell me drugs. So yes, that is that is one of the negative side effects of being in this field
Yeah.
for sure. Welcome to Twitter. Okay, Balazs, tell us a little bit about the 2.0 and how people will be able to find it and perhaps sign up if they'd like to participate.
Sure. So it's gonna launch somewhere in Q3, Q4. I think Q3 is realistic. So from September, and it is there are gonna be a few differences compared to the first trial, and the most important one is that there's going to be a local lab component, and obviously that's only relevant to people who are living in the Greater London area. But there are going to be some people who we're going to get into the lab and we want to run some additional tests like EEG, which is just not possible remotely. That's what really motivated this second edition of the self-blinding study. But then we also realized is that, okay, but like, we put all of this effort into setting up the infrastructure, might as well open it up for the rest of the world, people outside of London, and make it available for them as well. And the big difference going to be is that, so one of the criticism of the first study is that the sample was remarkably healthy. So, like, there you can give an argument, which I think is completely fair and feasible, that the reason why we didn't see a big placebo microdose separation, because the sample was very healthy, so it was a ceiling effect. There was just like not there was no space for improvement because people were very healthy at baseline to begin with. And with this second study, we want to recruit much more people who are taking microdoses to treat a mental health issue, either on a self-diagnosis, either after self-diagnosis or after a medical diagnosis. But we want to address that criticism. I mean, like all scientific study, the first study had some shortcomings for sure, and but this is the one that we judge the most relevant and where they're most likely going to be, or there may be interesting results. At this point, all microdosing trials published have been on healthy people. So this is not just a limitation of art, but generally an understanding of microdosing. We did some analysis in the first trial where we took people whose depression scores were high at baseline and we analyzed everything, and again didn't find a difference. So like our data is not indicative that for people suffering from mental health issue there would be a difference in the outcomes. But anyway, it just kind of feels like, it's not just due diligence, it's a bit more than that. I kind of feel like, that's an open question in microdosing. Okay, like, since our study was published, a few other studies came out that are more traditional clinical studies, one from the University of Chicago and one from Argentina, and by and large they have found what we have found. So I think, there is sort of like a building consensus in a healthy sample. But what about unhealthy, which is arguably more interesting than the healthy one? So we want to be, ahead of that a little bit, and that's why the emphasis is on people who microdose for mental health related issues in this second study. Self-blinding-microdose.org. Self-blinding, stuff like one as one word, and then dash microdose.org. That's where you can find information about the upcoming trial. Right. Actually, this is a good reminder for me that I need to update the website for the new information, because right now it's mostly about the results of the first trial. But anyway, that is going to be updated somewhere when the new trial is going to be launching, which is again, I think realistically in September.
Well, I'm sure they can follow you on Twitter.
Yes, just don't try to sell me drugs, but yes, there's definitely going to be Twitter announcements and all of that. So yes.
Okay, through Imperial, if they follow Imperial as well.
Yeah, so they can also follow me, Balazs, which is Psybalazs. It's going to be on both Twitter accounts. So I'm sure people who want to find it will be able to find it.
Perfection. Balazs, thank you so much for coming on and for all the research you do and for sharing it with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. All right, for everybody else out there, until next time. Thanks so much for listening to the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave a rating or review, as it helps others find the show. And if you'd like to learn more, you can find the show notes at plantmedicine.org/podcast, and there's information for clinicians at psychedelicmedicineassociation.org. Our incredible music was by the one and only Porangi. We'll see you next time.